This is Dayn Holstrom, Divorce Authority. We're going to be talking about a lot of different subjects in family law. There are some important items that I'm required to share with you so that you understand the limited purpose of my going over all of this information with you. No matter what the specific topic, it's very important for you to understand that this information is not intended as legal advice for any specific person or any specific type or actual case. My sharing this information with you is not designed to create an attorney-client relationship. Everybody's case is different, and nobody's results are the same. Just because we may discuss what happened in some other client's case that may in fact sound similar to yours or some other situation does not suggest that your case or the results would be the same or even similar. The discussion of specific cases are fictionalized and may not be real clients or cases. The purpose of these podcasts is to help you understand the framework of how these issues are decided, provide you a better understanding of the process, and hopefully give you insight as to how you might prepare and conduct yourself and your case to get a better result. There is absolutely no substitute for a consultation or hiring a competent, trained family law attorney, and I encourage you to seek out such an attorney as soon as practical in your case. Divorce Authority is a brand and registered trademark of Holstrom Block & Park, a professional law corporation.
I've been practicing family law for 30 years. I've been certified by the state of California as a family law specialist, so I know a thing or two about divorce. I'm Dayn Holstrom, and I am the Divorce Authority. Today's topic on Divorce Authority is a serious one. Today we're going to deal with domestic violence and all of its consequences and all of the things that can result from domestic violence. First off, what is domestic violence? Well, there's two parts to domestic violence. There's a criminal side, which is where somebody gets arrested and may go to jail and may even go to prison. Then there's the family law side, which is what is the effect of domestic violence in the family, in a divorce process, in a custody process, what can happen. And they are very, very different, but they are often completely nested together, and you have to be aware of both and potentials for both. It's a serious topic that came about decades ago because of a growing awareness of the problem, indeed the epidemic of domestic violence, and we as a society became way more aware of what happens silently inside the locked houses of people where spouses were being abused by their partners. And often, and still today, this pattern exists where the victim may be victimized many, many times before they finally actually come forward. After doing this for 30 years, I've seen some very serious issues of domestic violence, physical. I've seen emotional abuse that is just gut-wrenching. I've seen child abuse. And I've also seen fabricated claims of domestic violence solely being used to gain an advantage in the family law process. And all of them are equally despicable, and all of them require a very deft approach and awareness of consequences of a misstep. So, definition under the family law, which is different. Physical domestic violence is required generally for the criminal approach, but domestic violence in the family law context, a divorce, a parental dispute, etc., that's actually very broad, extremely broad, and it's designed to be extremely broad, and it's getting broader every year. So, is it physical assault? Of course it is. Physical assault is domestic violence. Is it, well, what about if somebody simply calls you names? Well, it depends upon the names and it depends upon the context. There are some things that a spouse or a partner may do that make them a lousy freaking partner, but doesn't constitute domestic abuse or domestic violence in the common sense of the phrase. So what else constitutes it? Well, damage to property. When I sit down with a client, and it's oftentimes more of a suspicion, sometimes they come in and they say, no, I'm a victim of domestic violence or I'm a victim of abuse. But more often, they don't characterize it that way. Very often, I become aware of it because of the way that they dance around answers and issues and the way that they don't communicate. And then I start going into what I do with what I perceive to be questions. When somebody gives me an answer that triggers that inquiry, I'll start asking questions. And sooner or later, what happens is I go through my group of the parade of terribles that I see over and over again. And the irony of this is that each and every time that I go through this with a victim of domestic violence, they're like, oh my God, how did you know? And the reason I know is because the patterns reoccur over and over again. So this is a very, very serious topic, and we're going to talk about all of the issues, how it affects custody, how it can affect your divorce, and how do you deal with it. Some of the triggers for me inquiring further in domestic violence, I may say, has there been any domestic violence? And I'll get an answer like this. Well, he never hit me. Well, okay, he didn't hit you. What has he done? And then you'll hear things like this. And these are some of my repeat phrases, and I apologize in advance for the profanity, but frankly, when these happen, people aren't talking nice, and so I try to recreate them in the environment that they often occur. And so what may happen is these are often come into dominating or controlling situations in a relationship, and so it's like this. Somebody may throw things, and I ask questions. Are they a thrower, a coffee cup, or a keychain, or a TV remote control, or something like that? Oh yeah. Are they a wall puncher? Are they a door kicker? Oh yeah, we've got 3 holes that he hasn't even patched yet, okay? Does he ever block? I use the word he, and I apologize in advance. That's somewhat of a stereotype. To be fair, more of the cases that I get in domestic violence are male versus female, but it's not all. So I'm using it generically. I don't mean to stereotype anything, because there are some horribly abusive women in relationships that victimize their spouses, the men. And the men, frankly, are trying to get away. And I don't want to disparage any particular gender, but I may use it just because it's what I see more often than not. Does the person ever block your way in and out of rooms because, God damn it, you need to fucking listen to me? You need to hear me. You need to understand. In other words, you need to conform your behavior to what I want you to do. And you're obviously not listening to me because you're not behaving the way I told you to behave. From a psychological perspective, we deal with a lot of psychologists in family law, and a lot of times where this comes from is what we call coercive control, and that is trying to control somebody's conduct by coercive physical, verbal abuse, economic control, and a variety of things. So all of these things I've described, by the way, are domestic abuse, okay? Waking you up in the middle of the night because, God damn it, you need to listen to me. Stopping you in the hallway and putting your arms up on the wall, blocking somebody's ability to leave, controlling their behavior and their conduct, taking their car keys, taking their cell phone, preventing them from contacting family members and support people, taking the keys to their car, blocking their car physically with your car behind them. All of these are domestic violence, and all of them occur on a regular basis. We mentioned name calling. Well, if one partner is 6'4" and the other partner's 5'6", and the 6'4" person stands 1.5 inches from the 5'6", I lost my height, but they stand over them and they're turning red and shaking their fist or their finger and talking down to them, and spittles come flying out of their mouth. Yes, that's domestic abuse. I don't care what the damn name is, okay? And obviously, the more toxic the name is and the presence of the children can also create a content of domestic violence. Why? Because if somebody's leaning in your face and they're calling you a horrible, foul, profane name, and you know, the common names that I recite are bitch, stupid lazy bitch, okay? Variations of the theme. And sometimes I make light of it with clients because it helps them know that I understand and they are not alone. But when you're doing that with a child in proximity, what is the parent thinking to do who's the victim in that situation? They're oftentimes more worried about the effect on the child. And so what they do often is they moderate their behavior, they nod their head, they wait till the storm passes, and then they go and console the child. That's a horrible situation. The laws were obviously written for a situation where serious injury and death was resulting, absolute death. And there's horror stories of judges that have denied restraining orders and the next day a child was killed. true story, happened in Southern California probably a decade ago, and I'm sure it happens around the country. That is not the fault of the judges or the judiciary. It's an imperfect system. And oftentimes victims of domestic violence choose to drop it and not go forward. Sometimes that's a great choice. It was an isolated incident. The perpetrator gets help and gets assistance, and they were able to work on their relationship and come out of it. That's a great, great, great result. From what I see, more times than not, it leads to an ending of the relationship. Coercive control. I'm going to give you $100 a week to pay for everything that you need for the house, and I want to see receipts. Some people listening to this may think that's normal. It ain't. You may think it's normal, you may believe it's normal because it's the way you've lived your life, but it's not a healthy way. It's horrible for your self-esteem. It's horrible for the long-term mental health of your children. Again, gender roles or gender identification. If a male child observes male-female behavior, they start modeling that. And next thing you know, your son is perpetrating violence on his female partner. Your daughter is being subjugated to her male partner. These are things that you may not see coming 10 or 15 years down the road, but it's happening. It's happening right in front of you, and you don't see it. Coercive control we talked about, coercive financial control, controlling conduct. It's very often, it's another one of Dayn's things that Dayn throws out, is that I oftentimes have a client that'll come in and say, but he said, or but she said. I'll tell them something and they said, oh no, but he said this, or oh no, but she said that. And about the third time I hear that from a client, I'll say to them, look, I want you to work on something. This is a tool for you. When you're running something through your mind or you're telling me something and you start the sentence with he said, I want you to, instead of telling me what you're going to tell me, I want you to insert in your mind the word bullshit. Okay? So when you start a sentence with he said, what you're saying is he said bullshit. In other words, it has no value. It has no merit. It is being said for one purpose only, and that is to control or manipulate you. In cases of domestic violence, it is very often that people can be controlled not only through threats and terrorism, but they can be controlled through, I love you, I'm so sorry, it'll never happen again. Think about the kids, think about what's best for us. That is also manipulation. And then you get into this horrible cycle and what we call codependency. A word of caution. A good divorce attorney wears many hats. One hat is the litigation strategist, the tactician, the bulldog, the advocate. The other hat is the therapist. How does that make you feel? What do you want to do? So as a word of caution, I am a shitty therapist, and I cost a lot more than most therapists. So please find yourself a good one. In a case of domestic violence, you must have one. Why? Because you need to learn how to protect yourself and not have your buttons, your emotional buttons, pushed to enable other people to control you. When he, she says or does something that makes you afraid, it is you that makes you afraid. It is you that becomes angry. And you got to understand and deal with that. I've dealt with a lot of psychologists, a lot of therapists. This is not intended to be psychological advice. Take it for what it's worth from my experiences with people that have gone through it. So how does this civil consequence of domestic violence, how does it play itself out in a family law proceeding? Divorce, custody, how? Well, the answer is California's provided an ability to get a domestic violence restraining order, for short DVTRO, okay? Or just DVRO. And what happens is most counties will allow you to get a restraining order either the same day or within 24 hours. Different counties have different rules. By way of illustration, Orange County, you have to give notice in most cases. If it's a case of a serious threat of physical violence, you can do a separate declaration that says, I don't want to give notice because I'm afraid I may not live to get to the courthouse. In that case, you don't have to give notice. There are cases in Riverside County where you don't have to give notice. You simply apply for the restraining order before noon, and at 4 o'clock, it'll come over the counter. They grant it or deny it. The other side doesn't even know you're doing it. In Orange County and Los Angeles County, similar to counties, you have to give notice But the court will almost always err on the side of caution about granting a restraining order or not. I think most judges look at this from like, okay, I'm going to look at the hardships. If I grant this restraining order and the person that filled out the paperwork and said all these bad things are happening is lying, what's going to happen to the other person? Well, they're going to get kicked out of their house. They're not going to be able to see their kids. And it's going to be a horrible situation. But guess what? Under the law, that horrible situation is limited right now to 3 weeks in most cases. But if they're telling the truth, and maybe I'm on the fence about granting it or not because it's borderline, and I deny it, what is the risk of harm on the other side? The answer is I'm leaving an abuser in a home after they know their victim has sought protection. And in that case, I'm going to err on the side of caution every time, and I'm going to grant a temporary restraining order. You might ask, what's happening under the auspices of COVID? How is that affecting the court processes and the ability to get restraining orders? And the short answer is that was what they fixed that like yesterday. I mean, we were locked out of the courthouse for months for regular hearings, but they found a way to do domestic violence hearings almost immediately. And the courts are doing it differently. Some courts, again, in case of Riverside, you simply file it and don't even tell the other side. Orange County is now doing them virtually. And so you basically submit your paperwork. The other side may get the ability to appear and say, here's my version of the story. But again, the court in most cases is going to err on the side of caution and grant it. So yes, you can still get a restraining order, notwithstanding COVID, over the counter or very quickly in any county. What happens if you get a restraining order if you're on the receiving end? Well, again, most often you're removed from the residence. You're removed sometimes from access to the kids. It depends on the nature of the violence. If it's abuse against a parent in front of a kid, or if it's abuse involving substance abuse and things like that, then there's a real possibility that you're going to be kept from the kids for that 3-week period. If not, if it's a he said, she said, there was somebody's finger was scratched, etc., then you know what? No, we're not going to include the kids in the restraining order, and we'll make some temporary custody visitation orders even during that 3 weeks. When I talk about this 3-week things, that can change. Why? Because the person who's restricted has an automatic right to postpone the hearing if they choose to. It's their choice. Sometimes there may be a criminal case pending, and we'll talk about the Fifth Amendment in a second. They may not want to go in front of a judge in the family law court and then wind up having their testimony used against them in the criminal court and they go to jail. A little bit about the process and procedures involved in a restraining order. So when you first apply, regardless of which county you apply in, the court can grant your restraining order, in which case they will set it for typically 21 days, as we've talked about, but they may deny it. Maybe you thought, or your attorney thought, there was adequate basis for a restraining order, a domestic violence temporary restraining order, but the court disagreed and the court denies it. That can happen. When that happens, they still set a hearing. It's not required to be in 21 days, but it often is. So even though you don't get a temporary, you're still going to have an opportunity to prove up your case. What's the difference? Well, when you first file, everything is based upon a written statement called a declaration or a narrative, where you say, this is what happened. You recite the incidents of domestic violence to the best of your ability. You decide the dates to which the time you can. You'll decide the repetitive conduct that happens so frequently that you can't even identify the last time it happened. You want to be careful not to overstate what's happening, like she hit me every day. I'll never forget, I had a trial one time where a person, in my opinion, she was not telling the truth, and the judge agreed with me because that's exactly what she said. She said, he hit me. And the court said, well, how often does he hit you? Every day. And the judge got incredulous at that point. Every single day. Every single day. Yeah, every single day. Okay? And it was just not credible the way that the message was being delivered. And that has a lot to do with body language, and that's the other big difference. So you got your written statement. The court can't read your body language. The court, nobody's cross-examining anybody. When you have the hearing on the permanent, that is subject to testimony. You have to get in the witness chair, you have to get under oath, and you have to tell the truth under penalty of perjury about what happened. And then the other attorney gets to ask you questions to try to flesh out your testimony, see if there's a motivation, see if you're fabricating it, see if there's a claim that perhaps you were the aggressor in the situation that resulted in you getting injured. And that's all done by live testimony in court with cross-examination. If you get your temporary restraining order, we talked about there might be custody orders, there definitely will be an order not to contact the protected person. That's what the vernacular is. You are not allowed to contact them directly or indirectly. So by way of illustration, if you tell a relative of your spouse to tell your spouse something, you just violated the restraining order. You never want to violate a restraining order. Why? First off, it's a crime. You will probably go to jail. And second off, even if the underlying allegation that got a temporary restraining order was either not very strong or even falsified, if you violate a restraining order, then guess what? It's far more likely the permanent one's going to be granted because you don't follow court orders. There may be orders related to the custody visitation, maybe a schedule, maybe no contact, maybe supervised visitation. That's another discussion for another day. There could be orders with financial restrictions. That is, you're not allowed to transfer money, assets, things like that. They've even added orders for custody of pets in domestic violence restraining orders now. So there's a variety of orders that can be made, but all of those are made until the hearing is set. Now, what happens if the other side comes back at the time of the permanent hearing and asks for an extension? How long can it go on? Well, there are two different scenarios there. The first is until the next available date. It may be 3 weeks out, or because of congestion in the court, it may be longer. There's two situations actually, where it may go out for a long period of time. What are those? One, the parties agree. A common resolution to a situation where we have an incident of domestic violence that is not a pattern of domestic violence, and a common resolution that competent attorneys may reach, if their circumstances are right, is a stipulation to keep the temporary in place for a defined period of time. That way we can say 6 months, a year, whatever, it could be a shorter time. That gives the person who's accused of perpetrating domestic violence the time to get counseling, time to do a little self-reflection, and have the temporary restraining order in place the whole time. So if that agreed time goes by, there's no new problems, then the parties may agree to simply drop the restraining order. And that happens with some regularity. The other situation where it happens is, at the time of the domestic violence creation, there was also a criminal filing of domestic violence. We talked about that way back at the beginning. What happens is these two cases go in parallel now. And what happens is somebody might be arrested, police are called to the house, the police talk to everybody. First off, California, yes, it is a law. If police show up, somebody calls for police based on a domestic violence claim, and someone is injured, guess what? Someone's going to jail. Going to jail does not necessarily mean you are the perpetrator. It doesn't mean that they're going to prosecute you. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything is going to happen, but that's the law. And they do this obviously because of the old days of the police showing up, telling everybody to behave, walking away, and then somebody gets hurt or killed. That's why they do that. What happens if the case is being prosecuted and somebody might go to jail for this act of domestic violence? Well, can you imagine? They go into family law where the criminal case is going on and they tell a judge, well, maybe I pushed her butt, or maybe she says, well, I hit him, but I did it in self-defense. Okay? Guess what? Under the law, that testimony in the family law case can be used against them in the criminal prosecution. So every judge in a situation like that, and every competent attorney, will advise a person not to put on the domestic violence hearing in family court until the criminal case is likely resolved, because of what's called your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. You have a right not to testify against yourself, and virtually every judge will allow the hearing with the temporary restraining order staying in place. So the victim is the protected person, is never in jeopardy while this case is postponed. So that's the process of how that works. Consequences of domestic violence. Holy shit, there's a lot of them. And not all of them related to a restraining order. Some people may go, I don't care a restraining order, I don't want to see them anyway. Okay, well, guess what? Most employers are looking at restraining orders, okay? Guarantee security clearance, it's gone. okay? High-profile executive position, you got a problem. Because particularly in today's the cancel culture that's going on, if you are accused of domestic violence, it can affect your career forever. That's one. Two, there is a presumption in California family law called Family Code Section 3044 that says if you are found to have committed an act of domestic abuse against the parent of your children, whether the kids are present or not is irrelevant, then you are presumed to not be fit for either shared or sole custody of the kids. Wow. You are odd man, woman out. What does that mean? That means, number one, you're going to have far less ability to have time with the kids. Number two, because there's two parts to custody, I'm going to only go into it for a little bit because that's another show, and that is physical custody, where are the kids living, versus legal custody, who has a say in what's going to happen in these kids' lives. Are they going to have surgery? Are they going to go into psychotherapy? What school are they going to? Those are all legal custody issues. You are stripped of your rights as a parent under 3044 if you are found to have committed an act of domestic abuse against your partner, the co-parent. That has a huge effect. Wow. And if that's not enough, it has another effect. When your time with the children is reduced, that has effect on child support. Why? Because child support is calculated on three factors. And that, again, that's another episode as well, but the gist of it is three factors: your income, his or her income, and how much time the children are in each person's care. So even if you had the children half of the time, a 50-50 timeshare, the court now finds domestic violence, guess what? It is quite probable, not absolute, but quite probable your timeshare is going to go dramatically. And when your timeshare, your time with the children goes down dramatically, your child support commensurately goes up dramatically if you were the paying parent. Conversely, if you had the children 80% of the time and you committed an act of domestic abuse, guess what happens? You just lost custody. And they went from 80% with you to oftentimes more than 80% to the other parent. And where you were receiving support before, now you're paying support, or your support cuts down to almost nothing. So there's a huge economic consequence. Now, why is that important? The biggest thing is this is one of the biggest causes for fabrication of claims for domestic violence. It's not unusual to have somebody fabricate a claim of domestic violence. It is sad, it is tragic, and it is reprehensible, but I see it regularly, and there are huge motivations for it. Perhaps the two parties are stuck in the same house, and if you saw a prior episode of this, we talked about people going through a divorce or a separation or the end of a relationship, and they're stuck in the same house. That is like a breeding ground for domestic violence or for the fabrication of domestic violence. Everybody's tense, everybody's uncomfortable, and stuff happens, or somebody claims it happens, or they exaggerate that it happened. Why do they do that? Why? Because guess what? First thing that happens when you get a temporary restraining order is they are kicked out of the house. You got peace. They're kicked out of the house. Oh, what if you want to relocate to another state? Well, guess what? Your chances of relocating go way up if you have sole custody of the kids. Wow. Remember what we just talked about rights under custody. So there's a tremendous incentive for doing so. While I would absolutely agree that most claims of domestic abuse are not fabricated, I also don't want to pretend that it doesn't happen, because it does. There's another side effect I want to talk about in domestic violence, and everything we're talking about as far as 3044 and the effect on custody, that only relates to the children of the relationship between the perpetrator and the protected person, okay? So if there's somebody that comes into a new relationship that may have had an issue of domestic violence, none of this applies per se, but it would apply to a custody issue. Hey, guess what? My ex-wife husband is hanging out with somebody when they have our children, and that person has a criminal conviction for domestic violence, or that person has a permanent restraining order against them in another relationship. I don't think that person should be around my kids. That may come up in a custody issue, but it won't come up in a protected person issue. There are rules for domestic violence in family law, and well, I'll sound a little verbose here. It deals with issues of consanguinity and affinity. And what does that mean? That means your second cousin can't get a restraining order against you under a DVTRO unless you're married to him. Okay. Sometimes it happens, only in Kentucky. No. So that's the other issue, is that it only works in romantic relationships, boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, boyfriend, girlfriend, girlfriend, whatever. Everybody's, as long as you're in a romantic relationship, or a relative. Can you get a domestic violence restraining order against your brother? Absolutely. Can you get one against a parent or child? Yes, you can. But you can't get one against your cousin. Okay? That's how that works. So, a couple of final thoughts on restraining orders. Big issue for some people. The second you get even a temporary restraining order, you are banned from having any guns or ammunition. And if you are caught, that is a felony. You are going to prison. Okay? You're required to turn over your weapons to either a licensed gun seller or to the police department. Obviously, before you do something like that, you should really talk to an attorney. Why? Because you don't want to put them in your car and drive them to the police station, and they find out that you're driving with them in your car and you violated the restraining order. There's a right way and a wrong way to do it. You make sure you find out the right way if you're in that circumstance. So what happens if you have a 50 gun or 100 gun collection? They're all gone. They are gone. And there are no exceptions. That's absolute. This is why this creates serious problems for people in the military or in law enforcement if they have a restraining order against them. It can absolutely prevent them from doing their job. In summary, always remember the public policy behind the creation of the Domestic Violence Protection Act, the ability to get a domestic violence restraining order, whether temporary or permanent. Be mindful of the codependent relationships, whether you find yourself in one or the other. Again, it strongly reinforces my advice not to live in a relationship, in a bad, toxic relationship where there's a possibility things could escalate to domestic violence, because the consequences can be life-altering and life-threatening, physically as well as economically, career perspective, everything. Never violate a restraining order in any way. Make sure you get good advice on what not to do. Can you post something on social media that you directed to your spouse? No, don't do that, okay? People do a lot of these things because they don't get good, sound advice. Get advice from a proper authority. Thank you for your time today. I hope you found the information helpful and to some degree sobering and insightful. That's what it was intended for. It's not intended to diagnose anybody or characterize conduct as domestic violence. For that, you really need to talk to competent legal counsel. If you're in a situation, I strongly recommend that you seek insight from a competent therapist to help you deal with what's going on and help you make good, rational decisions to protect yourself and your children. If you'd like more information, you can download our ebook, Divorce 101, at divorceauthority.com. Follow us at Divorce Authority. I'm Dayn Holstrom. When I do becomes I don't, turn to Divorce Authority.